Greetings, brothers and sisters. It has been suggested that we continue to do some sort of video Bible study here at Trinity, and I've been kicking around a couple different ideas, and the idea that I settled on for the time being is going to be a lectionary Bible study. And what this means is that every week there's going to be a video released sometime between Tuesday and Thursday. And that video is going to talk about the texts for the upcoming Sunday. So this video is talking about the three main texts that will be read, the Old Testament reading, the epistle reading, and the gospel reading for July 19th. So we're going to be looking at a text from Isaiah, a text from Romans, and a text from Matthew. And each week you're going to get basically a Sunday morning preview of the texts that are coming up on that Sunday. Now, why would this be important? Well, the lectionary readings are going to be heard. But as your pastor, I can usually only preach on one, maybe two of those texts. And typically I'll just focus on one. Some pastors want to integrate all three texts and tie them all together and preach a sermon on all three. But my preaching style is really just to focus on one text and then pull from other things that help illuminate or help us understand what the Holy Spirit is trying to teach us. And so I'll only usually focus on one out of the three. And when you hear the texts in church, you might want to hear what that text was about. Or maybe you didn't understand it, or maybe there was something that caught your ear, but you don't have a chance to hear more about because I didn't preach on it. And so this is an opportunity to look a little bit closer at the texts, and then on Sunday, when you hear them again, you'll have a better understanding of their context and of the main point that they're making. And so this is going to be the goal for this Bible study. And so let's go ahead and jump right into the Old Testament lesson. I'm also playing around with a bunch of new equipment. I'm playing with the church equipment for this Bible study, so I'm going to try and do a few different things. So if you see me messing with things, that's what's going on. I'm getting used to what this would look like and how this might work. All right, so looking at the text here, there we go. So here you have the text for the Old Testament lesson. It's Isaiah 44, verses 6 through 8. It reads, "Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. Who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me. Since I appointed an ancient people, let them declare what is to come and what will happen. Fear not, nor be afraid. I have not told you from of old and declared it. Have I not told you from of old and declared it? And you are my witnesses. Is there a God besides me? There is no rock. I know not any." So when you're looking at this text from Isaiah, there's a couple different things to make note of, and the first is its context. So this is in Isaiah 44, and it's in the middle of the chapter. So you got verses 6 through 8, so there were 5 verses before it, and there are several verses after it. And in the first part of Isaiah chapter 44, the big point of emphasis is on God choosing Israel, God choosing for himself a people. So 44 verse 1, "But now hear, O Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen. Thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you from the womb and will help you. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen. For I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour my spirit upon your offspring and my blessings on your descendants." And so what this text, the early part before we get to the text appointed for Sunday, is this idea that God has chosen for himself a people and that he provides for them. Then we have the text for Sunday, which talks about who God is and that there's none like him. And then after this section, the prophet Isaiah talks about idolatry. And so what this is God is setting up this argument in which here is who you are for me. You are my chosen people. Here is who I am. And so then the result is, what are you doing? Why is this idolatry occurring? It doesn't make any sense. I'm the only God, and I've chosen you. So what are you doing over there with the other idols? And so this is the point of chapter 44. It's kind of this big argument about why we're falling into sin. Why are you just openly going to another God? It doesn't make any sense. If you know who you are and you know who I am, then you don't need to bring in this third party, this other idol, this other thing to have it govern your life. And so there's this idea of being chosen, of being appointed, and that goes before, and then we have the text talking about who God is. Now, looking over to Isaiah 44, what you see in verse 6, you have this, I am the first and the last. Besides me there is no God. Well, this sort of language for I am the first and I am the last, we find that in another book, in Revelation. I am the first and the last. I am the Alpha and the Omega. And so here we have God using this description as a title, as a descriptor of who he is and what he is about. He is the first and the last. He is the eternal. And there is no other God. I suppose if I was going to preach on this text, which I'm not preaching on this text this week, we'll get to which one is going to be the focus of the sermon. But who is like me? This question right here in verse 7. Who is like me? That's the question at hand for this text. And a question that's always has to be asked when you're dealing with idolatry. Who are you replacing with God, and how is it better? How is going from Yahweh to Baal going to be an improvement? How is going from God to our 21st century secular culture or our politics or whatever we're going to replace with God? What's the difference between you and God? Because when we think about idolatry, the first person we often replace with God is ourselves. We're going to replace God as king with ourselves as king and put our desires, our wishes, our will above his. And so how can you compare between the two? The first and the last, the Alpha and Omega, the one who creates, the one who elects, the one who saves, to you, a fallen human being. What kind of comparison is that? Who is like God? Not me, not the world, not anything else. He is without comparison. So that's kind of the main thrust of the Isaiah passage. So let's go ahead and look over to the next one, which is going to be the gospel reading. And so we'll look at this real quick. It's from Matthew chapter 13. It's the parable of the weeds. So here is Jesus speaking. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of the kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears, let him hear." So this is the parable of the weeds. It's the next parable after the parable of the sower. And so you have the parable of the sower, which was the basis of Sunday's sermon, or the previous Sunday's sermon. And now we have the parable of the weeds. And I really like the parable of the weeds. I like all the parables in Matthew 13. I think they're very interesting and very important for the church to understand. So we don't need a whole lot of context here, knowing what came before with the parable of the sower. But one of the important things to note, as I try to find it here, here we go. When looking at the parables, so the parable of the weeds, there is an important phrase that we need to look at first. So the first thing we need to see is verse 24. He says to them, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." The kingdom of heaven is an important phrase. If there is an important phrase to understand what this parable is about, it's this phrase right here. See how cool it is that I can mark stuff and then you just see it on the screen? So, the kingdom of heaven, I've talked about this when we did the Sermon on the Mount Bible study, probably 6-9 months ago, when we looked at Matthew 5 through 7. But the kingdom of heaven is not a great translation of this phrase. It's better translated the reign of heaven. So the reign of heaven, or the reigning of heaven, or something along those lines, because when we hear the word kingdom, we're thinking place, and Jesus is not talking about a place. He's not talking about a place. If you think he's talking about a place, then you're automatically going to think, oh, he's talking about heaven and the way heaven's going to be. And that's not the case. The context of this parable is the way life is now, here in this place. He's talking about good people and evil people. He's talking about his work in the world. He's not talking about heaven, or the afterlife, or the new heavens and the new earth. None of that's being discussed in this parable. He's talking about the reigning of God, the reigning of heaven, the reign of Christ looks like this. And by reign, I mean the kingly action. So that's probably the best way to understand this phrase. The kingly action of God is like the weeds, the parable of the weeds. So if you understand that the way the kingly action of God is going to work is through what this parable looks like. So, in the same way that we talked about in Sunday's sermon, the parable of the sower answers the question, why aren't people listening to Jesus? Why is Jesus losing disciples? Why are people not following him? He's the Son of God. He's perfect. He's redeeming and forgiving people, and no one seems to care. Why is it? And we get the answer of the birds and the thorns and the rocky soil are forces that are pushing the word away from people. But there is good ground to be heard, for his word to be heard. So here we're answering the question, what's it like when Christ reigns? And the answer is, when Jesus is at work, He will go about and his servants will do his work, the servants being the church. So now we have the church is going out and it's sowing the seed, it's planting the wheat, it's doing a good job proclaiming the pure word. But then an enemy comes. Then an enemy comes and he ruins the field. Now, one of the things I talked about, I mentioned this in Sunday's Bible class, was that the parables are intentionally unrealistic. There is no rational person who's going to go see a team of people sow a field and then in one night go by himself and scatter seed among the field. No one's going to do that. No, it would take a gargantuan effort to sabotage an entire field without anyone noticing by planting your own seed. Farming is not a fast task. You can't just sow a field in 15 minutes. And you certainly can't do it in the dark, in the middle of the night with one person. It's unrealistic. But that's not the point. The parables are meant to be unrealistic. They're meant to be absurd in some of their detail to sort of draw out how absurd some things are, how different the reign of God will be. Now, the parable of the weeds talks about, let's switch back over. So we talk about the kingdom of heaven, and we see that men were sleeping, enemy came, weeds were sown. Master of the house doesn't want the things pulled up. Now, that's another key idea that's not clear by how we understand, or how most of us understand, wheat farming. So I lived in the breadbasket of Kansas. I learned about wheat farming. I'm still learning about wheat farming because I still have Facebook posts that come up with people who are harvesting wheat. I learned about a bug, the sawmill fly or something like that destroys wheat crops. Learned about that this past few days because somebody was dealing with a bunch of down wheat on the ground. And why did this happen? Well, there's a bug that destroys the wheat as it grows inside of it. That doesn't really matter to the text. That's just me telling you something interesting. The interesting part is the weeds here are not generic weeds. We're not talking about dandelions or clover or whatever, thorns and thistles and easy to spot weeds. Okay, it's not as if we got a wheat field and there's a bunch of dandelions and the master says, don't pull the dandelions, you might hurt the wheat. That's not the case. That's not what we're talking about. The Greek is more specific. The Greek is talking about darnel, which is a specific type of plant. Darnel, through almost the entire life cycle of the plant, looks like wheat. And to an untrained eye, you can't tell the difference between darnel and wheat until the grains have popped on the plant. So until harvest is just about there, can you tell the difference between a darnel plant and a wheat plant? And it has to do with how the seed structure is on the stalk. So one points out like it's sort of alternating, and one is not alternating, but sort of all. Anyway, I'm going to put a picture here, and then you'll be able to see it. So the big difference is a little bit of shine. So there's a little bit of a shimmer to darnel versus wheat, and the seed pattern's a little bit different. But when it's in the ground and when it's growing, you can't tell the difference. So that's an important point with this parable. The second important point is that darnel is poisonous. If you eat it, if you consume it, if your cattle consume it, they'll be poisoned. This is why it's important for the harvesters to gather the weeds first. You have to gather all the things that don't belong, all the poison, burn it, and then gather the harvest, so that the harvest is not corrupted by the poisonous plant. So this plays into some of the end times notes in the explanation. When Jesus talks about how the people, the evil ones, will be consumed in the fire and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, it has to be done because the darnel is poisonous. The evil ones are poisonous. They will continue to corrupt. And so this idea of the corrupting forces, or the poisonous plant, the poisonous weed being mixed in, and so all those are sort of important points. Now the last thing to mention on this one is you have the wheat and the weeds looking the same. So the wheat and darnel, they look the same. You can't, the big point here, which is a big application to the church, is, and let's see if I can find it here on the screen for you, verse 29. But he said, "No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them." So the way I heard this described is that Christ is unwilling to have collateral damage. So you can't have collateral damage. You can't sacrifice a wheat to get rid of a weed. You have to live with the weed. Now, this is one of the things that the church likes to do, is it tries to make itself perfectly holy. We try to get rid of troublemakers. We try to get rid of people we don't like. We try to get rid of anyone who doesn't fit. We try to make this some sort of, in a sense, we put a gate around the church and only let the people we like in. And so we're willing to sacrifice anyone who might look like a weed a little bit in order to preserve the wheat. Jesus teaches us differently. Jesus says to us, we don't keep the wheat out or the weeds out. We include everything, and we let God decide who the weed in the wheat is on the last day. On the last day, it's going to be obvious. On the last day, it's going to be clear. The ears are going to have popped. The wheat will look different than the darnel. Everything will be made clear. But until then, we don't know. And if we don't know, you don't get to judge. You don't get to make the call about who belongs and who doesn't. You don't get to make the call, this person could be saved, but this one couldn't. This one's too far gone. This one's going to forever be a weed. Because you and the church don't know. Even in the text, the harvesters are angels. Even the angels don't know the difference between a weed and a wheat. So how can you know? How can you make the distinction if even the angels can't tell which is a weed and which is a weed? So the lesson for us is one, that God knows and God's going to wait. That we need to be willing to have weeds among us for the sake of whatever wheat we might have. And maybe even furthermore, not to think anybody's a weed. Because how can you possibly know? It would be better for us to live and to act and to think like all are wheat, rather than that all are weeds. And that is what the reign of God looks like. That's what the kingly action of Christ looks like. That every single person is a wheat, worthy of saving. because that's how Christ lives. Christ dies for all. Christ is willing to sacrifice himself for the weeds and the wheat, for anyone. He is willing to lay down his life for all those who might call upon his name, regardless of how the world sees them. And so there's a lot of richness then in this parable to think about and to consider. All right, the last text is Romans 8. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see the whole thing. Get to hear some beeps. There we go. Got all sorts of fun toys to play with here. So Romans chapter 8, 18 to 27. This is going to be the sermon text. So starting at verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption, and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So, this text is what I chose to be the sermon text for this week, so I'm going to not give it as much detail as the last two. And I don't want to talk much more than 30 minutes, which I thought this was going to be a 15-minute thing, and I've doubled my time because, once you get me talking. So looking at, man, it'd be helpful if I was in the right book. Looking at Romans chapter 8, we had the first part of Romans 8 last Sunday, which I didn't talk about in the sermon. But what we see in this one, there's a couple different themes. 26 and 27 is a little bit of its own thought. So looking at these verses here, we see the Spirit's role in our weakness. So likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And that passage in and of itself is worth memorizing, recognizing that we have a helper when we are weak, when we are anxious, when we don't know what to do and what to say. The Holy Spirit steps in and speaks for us, intercedes for us to the Father. And so this allows us to cast aside fear, cast aside our anxieties, cast aside our worries, because we know that the Father is hearing our prayers when we don't know how to speak them, how to say them, how to work with them. That verse in and of itself is a great passage to have in your memory, to know where to find, to recognize as we go through some of the greater turmoils in our lives that we don't have to know the words to say in order for our prayers to be heard. And that's a huge comfort. Whether you feel like you're a good speaker or whether it's just anytime you deal with great distress, great pain, great sadness, you don't always know what to say. Even the most loquacious person, the most taught person always knows what to say. When true pain strikes, when true grief enters into our lives, we don't always have words. And sometimes all we have is groaning. And so this passage is great to think about those things and have that comfort of knowing that you don't have to have it at the ready. You don't have to always be on for God to know what you need. So then we have the other part, 18 to 25. When you're looking at 18 to 25, this is a big section about hope and our future hope, and recognizing that our hope isn't just for us, but is for all of creation. For the creation waits with eager longing. So it's not just us, which is an important thing to understand, is that our sin, our corruption, doesn't just affect people, it affects everything in the world. The world, creation itself, is suffering because we brought sin and death into it. So if the wages of sin is death, then we who are sinful bring death into a world that wasn't supposed to know it. We bring destruction. We bring failure and fault and disaster into the world. It's particularly our fault that the world is the way it is. That, whether the way, well, a great example is this: whose fault that there are species that go extinct? The answer is humanity's. Why is there pollution in the ocean? It's the humans' fault. If there are environmental crises, it's not because the world just all of a sudden had this crisis. You can find human fault. Now, what you do with that is your own thing, but we need to think that there is an aspect of environmental stewardship and being good stewards of the creation that God has given to us. But the recognition here in Romans 8 is that creation is affected by our sin, and because it is affected, it too looks toward the hope of the new heavens and the new earth, the hope of the new creation. It looks forward to our redemption. Let's see, what does it say here? It says, be set free from its bondage, corruption, obtain the freedom and the glory of the children of God, up until the pains of childbirth until now, growing inwardly as we wait adoption of sons, the redemption of our bodies. The redemption of our bodies is an Easter promise. It's an Easter promise about the resurrection of the dead. If the dead are raised, then sin has been taken care of. Death no longer enters into the world, which is the problem of creation. So when God comes and restores, when he comes and proclaims us to be raised from the dead, when he claims us from the grave, then in that moment, death no longer has power over us as God's people, but also over creation. And so there's a big thing. The hope of Christ expands beyond just ourselves, but into all the world. And so that's one of those interesting ideas to ponder and to think about, is not only does our sin affect creation, but so does our redemption. The gospel of Christ is good news not only for mankind, but for all creatures in the world. Now, that doesn't mean you go out and preach to your dog, but the world and those things in it, all living things in creation, and even in some ways the inanimate things, are all groaning for this salvation to happen, because they're waiting for death to be removed from the world. That pain and suffering is taken out of the world, because that's what Christ promises. It promises a restoration of the way things were before sin and before death entered into the world. All right, so those are the three texts. That's what I wanted to cover for this lesson. Thank you very much for watching this first video. I look forward to your comments. Soon, there's going to be a whiteboard over here. I haven't put it up yet, but in case I need to teach you with a whiteboard, I may put one up over here. that can be seen, or I may just stick with this the fun little document camera where I can write things and make notes and put smiley faces on stuff, and use highlighters and all of that. So we'll see how that works as well, but we'll just sort of see what the texts bring. So it was good to have you today. I hope this helps your Sunday worship and that you are prepared to hear the word of the Lord, especially from Romans chapter 8 this upcoming week. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a great rest of your week.